evening. This is the presentation of my MFA final project entitled Moving from Text to Textile, Designing Costumes for Dance. Dance is a visual art, observed in an instant and remembered or forgotten in the next. For audiences, dances seem to become recollections. Mental images of dancers moving in the setting of the work are clarified and colored by the costumes that the dancers wore. Designing costumes for dances based on or inspired by works of literature is the focus of this project. I investigate how the information and layers of meaning that exist within the text and choreography guide the process of designing and making costumes for dance. I consider what details incorporated into a costume design will provide visual information and that will complement, amplify, or frame the dance. When I began thinking about the research for this project, I planned to design costumes for an imagined ballet that was also based on a work of literature. My goal was to explore how literary analysis can guide the process of designing and constructing costumes for dance, as opposed to the same approach for designing costumes, say, for a movie or a play, or stage play. After being approached by my peers, Noelle Bahati and Christina Donofrio, and asked if I would design the costumes for their MFA projects, each of which were to be based on works of literature, I revised the scope of my plan. This design project involves using literary analysis and choreographic analysis as tools for designing and creating costumes for the choreographic work of both Noelle and Christina, as well as my imagined ballet version of Shakespeare's play, The Tempest. The first of the works created was Noelle's, and the costume designs followed the leads from the works of literature she used, which included a play of her own writing, poems from Anne Sexton, and the myth of Icarus in Ovid's poem Metamorphosis. Noelle's cast included 7 women and 2 men. The characters were to suggest various periods of time and emotional connections. From the literature and Noelle's explanation of the characters and the relationships between them, I developed designs for the costumes. Here's a look at how that process unfolded. The title of Noelle's piece, The Order of Things. I began sketching initially the costumes for the men because in our early meetings, Noelle suggested that she would like some of the characters to reflect a fashion phenomenon, fashion trend, known as steampunk, which is a fashion reference to clothing details from the mid-19th century that featured period fabrics and period silhouettes of that time. Another interest in the design detail of the steampunk look involves machinery, mechanical parts, cogs, wheels, anything that was associated with the Industrial Revolution. It also harkened back to 19th century British fashion, as well as the look of clothing that was worn by people who were expanding the frontier, the Western frontier in America. So for one of the characters here, I decided the 2 men I thought should wear fitted waistcoats, or as we would call them now, vests, that evoke the period. That's a very prominent feature in male steampunk attire. So I chose to use as close to period fabrics as I could imagine. The findings, or the buttons and trimmings, etc., I wanted to look metallic because of practical reasons of dancing and partnering, they couldn't actually be metal. I couldn't actually use chain because that would, be a danger to the dancers. So I had to figure out how to achieve the metallic look. That was achieved by using gold metallic thread pieces of trim that I then reshaped to look like chain. And that process of making those vests, I also wanted to create this as accurate a period look and feel to those vests, which actually could be a very simple project, but that was not really the scope. I tried to make it a little more sophisticated than that by drafting the patterns myself and then constructing them completely by hand without using any machine stitchery at all. So they were completely constructed with hand stitches and with hand tailoring techniques, a process which is extremely labor intensive and time consuming, and as I found out, it took as long to do the men's vest as it did to construct the gowns for the women, which I was fine with. But
here we can see I was drafting, moving from the muslin in the bottom to the draft paper on the thing. The tailoring of the vests was also functional. They both had welted pockets, which, in many of the photographs that I looked at of the steampunk men's, they usually had pocket watches and accessories that would tuck into a pocket. So I didn't put those into the costume for the dancer, again, for practical reasons. But I wanted the pockets to look like they were functional and not be absent, because very often there is not a function. So that's the inside of the garment. And there we see the outside of it there with the double welted pocket. For this first sketch that was worn by the character, his name was Eddie, I wanted his accessories also to be or his trim to be done with leather. So you can see the bottom welt there is in leather, and his lapel was also done in leather, which provided a technical challenge because sewing through leather is not the same as sewing through, say, cotton. The second character referenced more Icarus, and also he had a vest that covered his rather Greek-looking shirt, and that too was a steampunk idea. I wanted his to look a little bit more evening wear elegant, and so I chose a damask fabric of a paler tone, a shade of blue, and his lapels were a cream color that I then embellished with beading. And here we can see his pocket, fully functional and ready for the watch that he never got to wear. One of the accessories, or one of the details that Noel wanted to have in the men's Daniel's pants for the last design there were stripes down. We were trying to figure out how to incorporate that and still have it be period. So I had this braided trim that did have metallic thread in it, I thought would work. But the white was it was just not quite right. So this is where the collaboration back and forth between Noel and I continued to talk about it, from the broadest ideas to the minute details, and it was very productive and very, very inspiring. Ultimately, I dyed that trim a shade of deep tan so that maybe it would look like braided leather, and we looked at it, we pinned it on, and decided, no, we don't need that. So here we can see the inside, a little bit more of the specific detail that went into the tailoring of the lapels, because they do have to roll. In order to do that, the edges need to be taped, and the pad stitching and the cross stitching you can see there. Also, I wanted the vest to be fully lined, so the colored fabric you can see in the background there, that is mostly for the wearer because they never take the vest off and you never see them. And the back of the vest is a contrasting fabric to the front, but the inside is still a different fabric. One of them, the first design, the inner fabric is leopard, and that really made that gentleman very excited to put on his vest. It's actually reversible. It's clean enough you can wear it to the outside. I said, if you really feel compelled to, ask Noel if you can wear it with the leopard side out. That didn't happen either. He enjoyed it. For the women, one of the inspirations that I had for their silhouette came from a position in the dance, a movement in the dance, where the two women were sitting side by side on the floor, and it reminded me of an Alma Tadema painting of Grecian women, his idea of Grecian women, on a bench. And they had long flowing Grecian gowns. I thought, well, maybe I can adapt that a little bit differently and make it a little more contemporary. There was also a physical relationship between them that maybe connotated a broader sexual connotation. And I thought, well, that's interesting, so how can I design a dress that's going to convey that tastefully? And I thought, well, there's birds and bees, and I wanted one of the dresses to be completely covered or strewn with flower petals. I said, okay, flowers, I said, birds and bees. Okay, we'll go with birds and bees. So I came up with the idea of designing I called it the bumblebee dress with just stripes, and I imagined it in gold and black stripes. And after seeing the rest of the palette evolve for the piece, I decided that the black and the gold was just too strong of a contrast. So that, after meeting more with Noel, we decided that we'd switch the color. So that, rather than being tube tones, became a monochromatic. And this is the first draping of that. It's a bias cut silk charmeuse dress. And I used the shiny face side and the matte side, and I created this two-tone effect by using just a single fabric. And ultimately, the fabric that was chosen was the green you see there. The third dress in the set of the 3 gowns I made for the women was out of this pale blue silk charmeuse. And here's the dress, the green dress. And it's before I sewed it together by machine, I did have to pin it together and then hand baste it together to make sure that all of those seams were going to line up. The most difficult, I was rather surprised, this dress took less than 2 yards of fabric to make. It was a mathematical, it was like a Rubik's Cube pattern for this dress to cut it out to get the pieces to like, because they graduate in size and the ends wrap around to the back. So that said, the seams were in place, but getting the points to line up and turn the corners smoothly was the big challenge. This was also a little bit of a personal miracle because this dress required not one alteration when I put it on her. It fit her perfectly. And there are no side seams in this dress. All the seams go diagonally around the body. There's no, typically in a dress, there's a side seam to connect the front to the back. In this case, that's not so. So that was a very interesting design process. There you can see the back of the dress. In order to have these straight silhouettes and still enable the dancers to accomplish any range of motion, whether it be walking across the floor or jumping or turning or doing floor work, you have to make accommodations for the range of movement. And one of the things I did in these gowns was add a pie-shaped wedge of fabric with the same, or in these cases, a sheer fabric. That insert is called a godet. And I had an idea that I wanted it to almost look invisible, and I had some very fine cobweb density fabric that I thought, well, if they, walk in a windy day, it'll shred. But I thought, well, let's just try and see if it works, and if it doesn't, I'll replace it. And they made it through all of the dances and all the choreography, and that fabric remained intact. So that was also very interesting. Things, how fragile a fabric can you use, and what, it was a test really to see how durable something very fragile can be. There's no stress on that piece of garment, so that also enables it to have a little bit more chance of surviving. So in this piece, you can see the sparkly insert at the back, which you'll see later, is in place. So therefore, when they were rolling around on the floor or jumping over each other, nothing. The dress didn't impede their movement. So there are the three, as I call them, my three uses. The inspiration for the back of the green dress, or for the necklace that I wanted to hold up the green dress, I wanted to look like jewelry, but again, for practical purposes, it couldn't be a piece of jewelry. So I designed a beaded necklace for it, which, as I thought, it's very funny that sometimes inspiration comes on the second cup of coffee with the power bill in hand. So I did not hesitate to sketch the idea before they vanished from my mind, and it proceeded to go to my beading frame, and there I am crochet beading the bugle beads into place, and then in the voids of all of the angles, I sewed Aurora Borealis crystal. One of the design motifs throughout Noel's piece was also the idea of wing, which goes back to Icarus and the making of the wings and flight and that idea. So for the narrator's coat, I don't know if you can see on the bottom, all of the sections of the coat that she wore are cut to arced shapes that resemble the tips of wing feathers, and they graduate in length as they go around the coat. I also wanted the narrator to have actual feathers on her coat, and in the production, actual feathers actually fell from the ceiling to the floor. So we ordered feathers, and then Noel, Burton, and I were deciding, well, when I got to that point, I said, well, the feathers can lie on the lapel in many ways. They can go down, they can stick up to the side, they can go up. I said, what, do you have a preference? And I thought, well, what did Daedalus do when he was making the wings for Icarus? So I looked at the poem, and it said that he arranged them in a cascading range. It said, cascading range, we'll do it in a cascading range. And he attached them with linen and yellow wax. I said, well, that's interesting, because I always wax my thread with beeswax so it doesn't tangle. So Daedalus worked for Daedalus, it should work for me. So I placed the feathers on the collar. Now imagine sewing feathers to anything. Yeah, I have done it before. I've sewn feathers to wires for hats and all the thing, but when you're trying, it's like shingling a collar with feathers, basically. Actually, I did shingle something this summer. I thought, well, if it can do with cedar shakes, it should be the same thing with feathers. No, not true. So I was sewing along, and it was coming. They were progressing, and it was looking fine. And suddenly the
thread was not pulling through. I said, something's not right, but it doesn't look knotted. And I kept going and going through, and it's harder and harder to pull through. And I said, something's very wrong here. So I turned the collar over, and there was a mass of down fuzz that looked like a chick was hiding under this collar. I said, well, why is this happening? So I did a little thinking, how do I solve this problem? It's, you can't have this mess back there. But what had happened is the wax on the thread was drawing the down from the shaft of the quill of the feather through the fabric into the back. A problem I hadn't foreseen. So I cleaned it up and told them the story. She said, you must tell that story tonight. So nevertheless, the feathers got onto the collar, and that was kind of our ongoing joke about, do you want feathers on that collar? No, thanks. Covered the feathers. So there's the array of costumes for that piece as they then were hanging in the rack before they were run onto the stage. There's a little bit closer look of the men's vest, which we didn't get to see a photograph of earlier. You can see the fabrics. There, the gold that you see, those are the gold trims that I used to represent what would be chain or brass buttons and other hardware that, like I said, wouldn't be practical. Similar to my work with Noelle, my work on Christina's project began with meeting and discussing with her the choreography that she was going to create that was based on 3 psalms. In our initial meeting, we talked about the mood and the feeling of the piece, and what cues from the text or the context written in the written words might guide the costume design. The costumes, we felt, should not be the Old Testament desert attire of the ancient period, nor should they suggest a specific character or a socioeconomic class or ethnicity. The ideal of universal messages within the text prompted our discussion of what physical element is common to the desert religions, namely Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They all originated in the desert. And we're thinking, well, desert, they're a universal message, it's in a desert, what's the common denominator of the desert? It's sand. Sand, there's every sand, desert, sand. Okay, sand will be the guiding motif. So it's a guiding motif it was, and that really influenced the colors, the contours, the shape, even the texture and the trimming that I would choose to just have a baseline of my approach for the design. The choreography really informed the silhouette. The piece involves point work for the women as well as floor work for the women. So I had to take into consideration what the physical needs of the costume had to be while they were sliding across the floor, and how was it going to move any differently if the women were doing point work that might have it would shape their bodies in different positions than had they been solely on the floor. The initial design we thought would maybe be a leotard, a fitted bodice with a short skirt of we hadn't really decided on the fabric. I felt that it should be a stretch fabric just for practicality. From the beginning, we always thought, it was my idea and shared with Christina, how these insets should look, and I thought it should be very almost monochromatic and very subtle to create shades, and that would be that idea of glistening sand, where we could get those details into that. And that then evolved into some other design elements. There are references to water in the song, so I thought, well, maybe we could add some blue into that. And that ultimately we decided not to do. But there again, this collaboration back and forth, we were constantly tossing out ideas of what images want to kind of lie behind the choreography, which is really at the fore. This was my design for how the hem might be embellished as it moves from fabric to some other texture of fabric that was not the dress or not the skirt itself, to also suggest pebbles or sand, or in this case maybe the rippling of water. So the final design then became this, which was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 insets times 12.
there were lots of pieces. So I said, well, I think that the palette for this, if you go to the hardware store and go to the sandpaper section, you can see the palette that this will be. There's black sandpaper and there's garnet sandpaper. I probably won't use those, but all the shades you can use in between, that would be fair game. I thought I should take this a little bit further, so I thought the perfect place to do research about sand is the beach. So there I was last summer, getting increasingly tan, walking around, taking photograph after photograph after photograph of the sands on the beaches of Lake Michigan, which I recommend everyone visit. And as you can see in my screen background, I think that photograph is the same thing there. I also wanted to see how water over sand affected the texture and the glistening of those colors and of the texture. Here, these are bubbles of air in the water. That helped me kind of get ideas of how reflective I could get in these insets with the trim without it looking, too shiny or too sparkly, and still have depth there. And you can see that there's some pretty dark contrasts in there, as well as the brilliant light. There the water's a little more clear. I like that photograph because the spattering of light that was reflecting off, I thought that would be a good scale for if there was going to be beaded trim of any kind, which I hope to have in the upper applique. And here again we can see that. Now there you can see it's very subtle, but just even the tiniest shade of deeper grains of sand, I was getting very specific with the sand analysis. I thought, okay, it's going to be fabric, it's going to be beads, you need to pull it back. But it helps to have all of these images in your head to just as the goal. And also I was wondering if there should be any dark contrasts, and those are little air pockets or air bubbles that just emerge from escaping air when the water recedes. Ultimately I didn't put that dark. Here we have just more textures of various colors of the sand. It was also very informative because I did want to create texture on the flat dresses. We did decide they would be dresses, so I didn't want them to just look like flat silhouettes. So I wanted to consider how, in sand, this is, I think it's after rainfall droplets hitting the sand, and how it creates those pockets of shadows and ridges that are highlights and lowlights. And also what footprints or the larger contours especially, they really inform the shapes that I would use to create for that. So it had a little bit more, a shape of that element that you would actually see in nature. So the palette then for the fabrics became these shades of neutral beiges, and there was a couple of gray, and then there was a beautiful white fabric. And I considered what fabrics would be used. The fabrics of the time would have been either linen, or the ancient, of the biblical time, Old Testament time, would have been wool or linen or cotton. And cotton doesn't move particularly well, and wool challis might have enough stretch, or it might be cut. It would just be too hot and thick, I think, for the nature of the piece. So I decided to use linen, and I had anticipated finding beige, oatmeal, and white, but I did come across this array of colors of linen and proceeded to buy everything in the store. Over Thanksgiving break, no less. That was the other thing. I was shopping for this in the season when, who's making linen summer clothes but me. So for the insets, I knew that I wanted to layer various sheer fabrics, and I wanted to achieve very subtle color gradations, and to do that, I treated it like watercolor. So here you can see all of the different, each one of the 5 appliques that I created had 4 layers of net. And that sheer, it's mostly tulle, which is this. Very sheer, very fragile. So if the women are rolling around on the floor or partnering each other in any way, and that tool gets any stress on it, it is guaranteed to shred. So I knew that I had to cover it with a little bit stronger fabric, and that's what that beige fabric is here. So every one of the appliques, you can see the beige pieces floats over the array of colors. And as you can see, there were no 2 that were the same. So I was mixing and matching, and that took a weekend. But it was very fun to see how the different layers of the colors, it's very similar to painting a watercolor painting. You add a shade of color to this and a shade of color to that and see how they play. And you can see the transparency of the fabrics there. It really made a charming effect. And the brilliance in it are metallic flecks, mostly silver. And then when on the bodice, they look like that. And I didn't put the beads on because I thought, I did too much. I didn't want to overdo it. Christina I just let it up to her, and she said, I think I want the beading. I said, okay. I would have beaded it before I put it on the dress, but I was so excited to. It was like, okay, no problem. So I went to the bead collection that I happen to have. Who doesn't have a bead collection? And picked out colors that I, would want to incorporate into the piece. And it wasn't going to be, Academy Award neck to foot beaded gown, but it was going to be, various pieces of them. So I then scattered them out and tried to, remember and look to my photographs to see how those, different tones, lined up. And I knew I was not going to make it that dense, but I just wanted to see how many different shades of beads there are. As you saw on the previous slide, there were really quite a few different colors of. Some of the clear beads had silver linings, some didn't. Some had color. Like one of the clear beads has a pink inside, so I really had a fun time mixing that. That's about how sparse. And then I also discovered while I was doing it, rather than putting one bead per stitch, I put 2 beads, and rather than putting 2 of the same beads, I did 2 different beads. So then I had to, I was constantly mixing and mixing. Well, taking time to decide all of that and just keeping going, it just went like that. So the fun part always goes by so fast. So I came back and everyone said, how did you beat all those dresses? I was driven, but I was inspired. And that's how they finally came out. And the beading was just on the upper collar, or upper neckline part. And that's for practical reasons too, because I didn't want it to feel uncomfortable if they were going to roll onto them on the floor, and I certainly didn't want them to crack and break and become a hazard. And there we can see where it lies on the neckline. And then here and below, you can see how those appliques did shimmer. And in the light in the production, that trim is probably one of the most subtle trims I've ever done, because sometimes you could see it and sometimes you couldn't. And I like that effect, and because I'd like to see it more. But that wasn't the point. The point was to showcase the choreography and the dancing. And this, I thought, was a very subtle and effective frame for that dance. Making costumes from one's own design with oneself means having several conversations alone. So I've been talking to myself a great deal since the time last summer when I've been brainstorming ideas about these and developing sketches for these projects, especially The Tempest, which was mine, and I was my own collaborator. I don't always agree with myself, but I'm very convincing. It's like, of course you can do that. It's like, but you can't, but you will. So for the third and final phase of my project, which began following Christina's project, which premiered in the beginning of February, I had been thinking about the Tempest costumes all along. I just hadn't put pencil to paper or scissors to fabric. I decided to make and design my costumes for 4 of the characters for this imagined ballet of The Tempest. The characters I chose were the ones I wanted to costume the most. Everyone said, are you doing this? I'm not doing the bad guy. Don't want to do the bad guy.
There you go.
So I chose to costume Prospero, who's the Duke of Milan, and he's one of the principal characters who makes all of these magical things happen. His daughter Miranda, who is shipwrecked with him, Ferdinand, who arrives via shipwreck also, and Ariel, who's the spirit that is at the command of Prospero to do his bidding throughout the play. So to convert the costumes and I did do some research. I didn't want to replicate stage play costumes or even Elizabethan costumes, but part of my research did inform me that no expense was spared on stage costumes in the Jacobean period, and lavish fabrics were absolutely part of what audiences expected to see on stage. And I said, that is exactly what I'm going to do. So I then thought, well, they're shipwrecked, and very often the play is, everyone's in tattered costumes, which is reasonable. However, there are lines in the play that say that Prospero and Miranda were not marooned on this island without their finery. And I quote the play, "Rich garments, linens, stuffs, and necessaries
or in a trunk. Now, I thought that could be jewelry or accessories or any number of fine things that miraculously made it through the storm. And that prompted me to create costumes that remained, perhaps by magic, pristine and intact. So for Prospero's jacket, I did look to Jacobean portraiture just to get an idea of the period silhouette. This was Shakespeare's last play that was produced in London, so they were into the Jacobean period. And I thought, well, there's no reason why Prospero and Miranda can't be fashion forward, so I looked at late Jacobean costumes, just to look at what kind of sleeve detail and what especially the trim along the hip line was prevalent. Now these are artists' renderings of, there's no real, I didn't actually see costumes from that period in a museum or images of them, but I just was basing that on oil paintings that I'd seen. And I just pulled some different ideas of that. I also knew that my fantasy fabric for this would of course be Milanese damask, because at the time that's where all the damask fabric was coming. It was either damask or silk, satin, or velvet, either from Milan or Florence. I don't have access to that fabric, so I had to figure out how to make the costumes look like that, and how to make them danceable in a ballet and not be heavy, or heavy, and they can be ornate, but they can't be heavy. So I was already considering what I could do to the surface treatments to give these costumes a little bit more period look. For Ferdinand, I thought he should be a little more dashing and sporting, because he's the heartthrob of the story, who Miranda is confounded by she thinks he's a vision. She's never seen him. She arrived on the island as a girl and grew up to be a young woman and only saw her father, so she was quite smitten, and justifiably so. He is the king's son and is heir to the throne of Naples. Quite a good match. So I thought that he would probably have a little sportier look. His jacket, which was also named a jerkin in that time, would probably be more close-fitting, perhaps to accommodate for sword fighting or holding your posture while you're sitting at dinner forever. For Miranda, I had a couple of ideas of the necklines. I knew I wanted to have a square line. There were many portraits where there were these beautiful square necklines on the women's dresses, which I thought would be an interesting change of pace. Very often ballet bodices for classical or romantic necklines they're rounded, they're not particularly square. That could have to do with a more rounded look for a different aesthetic for a classical or romantic ballet. I also wanted her skirt to certainly be full enough to facilitate movement, and I wanted it to have a conical shape, because there were some beautiful portraits that the skirt parts of the dresses looked like they were just absolutely rigid. Well, they can't be rigid because she has to dance, but we don't want the ballerina to look like she's wearing a cone. So I had to figure out how to achieve that look, and I also didn't want to have the skirt look like a full romantic tutu. Now, full romantic tutu is mid-calf length, very full, gathered at the waistline. And side note, this is the tool that a romantic skirt would, in the day, it probably would have made a silk tool, which is a small fortune. The lighting designer said, how much tulle is up there? How many romantic tutus would this tool make? And I added it up. It would make 2.5. That's how much tulle. And I don't think I want to have that. That's a silhouette. I mean, that's if you're a sylph and Giselle, or Willie, Giselle, excuse me. You'd wear that kind of skirt, but I didn't want Miranda to have that. Plus, that was a different period of time. So I experimented with the cut of the skirt, and having just recently done some research on what Christian Dior did to recreate the silhouette of skirts, I thought, I'm going to take a stab at that. And as you will see in a few moments, how that worked. So I achieved a period effect without it weighing a ton, and without it having a great deal of fabric, especially gathered around the hips, and yet still having a very full skirt. For Ariel, I thought that he should defy all period and place and time. So his costume, which in Shakespeare's play, there is a note that says that character wears a garment that the audience knows, oh, that character's wearing that jacket, that means he's invisible. Okay, costume the invisible. I don't know how to do that. So I thought, have him blend into whatever element he might be in. In one part of the play, Prospero asks Ariel to disguise himself as a sea creature. So I thought, okay, he can blend in. Maybe he's in the water, maybe he's in the air. And I had these wave motifs as his design idea, and created this silhouette and this shape and this design for him, and a palette to match. The wave motif was something that I used as the trim idea for mostly for Ariel's costume. And also the curvilinear trim that I put on Prospero's also suggested that the rippling wave that you see down in the corner there. Getting back to how to create period fabric out of this velvet is old, it's 20th century velvet, circa 1990 something. I know, but it was red, it was velvet, and I had it, so this is what it's going to be. But red velvet is just a little bit, we love Santa, but I didn't want the guy to look like Santa. So I thought, let's embellish. When in doubt, embellish. So I knew that I wanted quilting, so I cut out all the pieces and then I quilted vertical stripes into that. That quilting was another way that fabrics would have been treated to give them surface texture, give them design detail. And I also had done some research on, and I had done this, but not on a costume before, so this is all part of the ongoing costume research here, of embossing velvet. And what I did for this is I had these appliques, and that process, I did do some test patterns, as you can see here, before I really did the deal. And I tried different laces. It involves putting the lace onto the fabric, or those appliques. It can be lace as well. And just applying hot iron and steam to it. And what it does is it crushes the pile of the velvet, which is, imagine your lawn. If you lay a blanket down, you have a picnic on lawn, you take it away, and then you've got a flat part in the lawn. So that's basically the physics that go into that. Then it was a matter of deciding and designing and arranging. And it's like, well, it could go here, it could go there, it could go up. Do I want it reversed? Is it here? All of these things. But when it came to it, I just had to put it down, because there's no margin for error in that step. And as I would just recut the whole thing. And at that point, I did not have time or desire to recut. Okay. So here's the embossed motif that I used for part of other parts of Ferdinand's jacket. In order to create luxurious trim for Prospero, I layered 3 different trims. One is a brocade ribbon behind, a metallic ribbon in front, and then of course this trim, actually this braided trim on the side. Do you remember where that was from? It's not a test. From those white stripes that were on the blue pants. That's the color that I dyed it. I still like that trim. At least not one. So I was thrilled to use that. The bodice, I decided I wanted Miranda's dress to be made of silk, and I wanted the bodice to be made of silk satin. And I'd worked with silk-faced satin, where the surface of the fabric is silk thread and the base is usually rayon. And that's fine and supple enough to work with. Pure silk satin is very difficult to work with because the individual fibers are so fine and it's woven so tight, you can hear the needle pierce the fabric when you stitch to it. So it was a surprising challenge, but when it is sewn together, it's worth every effort. And here you can see the pieces of her bodice laid out, and it is that, in order to create an even softer line to the bodice, there's an interlayer of very fine baby flannel, and then a firm cotton layer to the inside, which will really do the work of the garment, so that all of that stress is not just happening on the satin itself. Part of the embellishments that were used in the Jacobean period and Elizabeth period at that time was embroidery. So this was my big opportunity, to experiment with various silk threads and metallic threads to create an embroidered bodice, center front, which I've embroidered things, but I've never considered that would be a viable thing to do on a ballet bodice, and I thought, why not? So I found a piece of damask fabric that I liked, and I took patterns and pieces from it and traced it off onto
paper and then transferred that to the back side of the silk, and then I had to thread mark it so I could see it from the front side of the silk, and then proceeded to embroider it. And that is the beginning of the embroidery for Miranda's dress. So dance costumes must first and foremost enable dancers to execute any range of movement required by the choreography. Functionality must coincide with the form of the costume. So in the following excerpts, we'll see how the floor work and point work are executed in various shapes and styles of costumes function.
Streams make glad the city of God, the holy place where the Most High dwells. God is within her, she will not fall. God will help her at break of day. Nations are in uproar, kingdoms fall. He lifts his voice, the earth melts. The Lord Almighty is with us, the God of Jacob is our fortress. The desolations he has brought on the earth. He makes wars cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the shields with fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth.
Sketches, photographs, and video recordings can help us understand how costumes for dance are developed and how they function. Seeing actual costumes modeled by dancers enables us to see how costumes become connections between the text and movement. To conclude this presentation, 14 costumes from this body of work will now be shown. Thank you.
easier when beautiful people wear my stuff. Aren't they great? Yes. Very nice, everyone. Beautiful. Now the part about me. No, that was it. At this time, I'd like to take questions.
What was your favorite part of the whole process?
My favorite part? That's a very good question. What is my favorite part of the whole process? I asked a colleague of mine that same question when I was working at a costume shop in New York. She said, well, it sounds kind of silly to say, but sometimes whatever step you're on at the time. I said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, it's fun to think of the ideas. It's fun to drape a pattern. It's fun to shop for fabric if you have a budget. But sometimes it's fun to figure out how to make it look like $1 million if you don't have $1 million, so that's part of it too. Working with the different people. I would say that what made this particular project most enjoyable for me was a collaboration that I had with Noelle and Christina. I learned to get along with myself, so that collaboration was okay, but I really enjoyed working with them. It just amplifies your own idea. I could have the idea of it would go from idea A and idea B, and we'd arrive at idea C again and again and again, and that was very encouraging. So I told both of my collaborators that this is definitely a benchmark for me. It is the example that I inspire all of my future work, most of my future work, to follow. That was very fulfilling. So I would say working with my collaborators was probably my most enjoyable. Yes?
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you use the source text. So kind of the literary component, or how that worked with your process.
The question is, how did I use the literary text as a component for the design process? A lot of it I looked, first of all, to figures of speech. What if there were any imagery or analogies to either place or time. It's kind of hard to interpret feeling into it, but there were a lot of, in the Shakespeare, there are some cues that would guide, the particular garment. Psalms were tricky because there are many layers of meaning there. Part of that was looking at the rhythm and the meter, and there's an element called parallelism where two things can be meant at the same time and said differently. So I looked at that. How can we have choreography and costumes both saying the same thing the way the text is, implying, multiple meanings. Certainly look for things that might indicate place or time or season. Those are pretty obvious, but there's not often reference to the costumes in the text. Noelle's piece, there was, interestingly, both the Icarus, Shakespeare's play and another referenced ancient Greece, and they also referenced ancient Greek mythology. So the Daedalus, Icarus myth, the language was there, the feathers, that was definitely there. And then also the idea of the wing motif, I was literally looking at that in flight. I think that's smattering of the words. And I did go back and forth. I think one of the funniest and most ironic ones was like, well, how did Daedalus make the wings? I think, well, maybe there is a recipe for how to do that, and there it was. So that's fun to find those little cues that you don't. When you're reading a piece of literature, you're not necessarily thinking, oh, this is going to transfer to a garment, but I do, if that's the project. And you start to read the literature differently. You look for different things. Like when you do any research, you're looking for certain types of information. You're going to target what you're looking for. And so certainly imagery, figures of speech, put it most succinctly. That's what I look for. Yes?
Thank you, Ron. This is really exciting to see all this come to fruition. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what you found between the moment when you were designing the costumes, you made the costumes, and then those costumes went onto Bodies in Motion. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about any surprises that came up for you in Noelle's and Christina's costumes as dancers started to dance with them. So kind of
question is what did I take away from seeing the costumes that, be realized on dancing bodies, dancing people? That's an excellent question, because I had some big concerns. Liliana and Maddie, peach dress, green dress. As you saw, that was a surprise for me. Very nicely done. That was in the piece. And I said, well, we're afraid to bring. I said, it's a dress. If something happens, I will fix it or we will change it. So I just looked at what that costume was doing for them, and if there was any problem with it, it was a dress. There weren't problems. If they were, there weren't really any problems. It was very interesting to watch the peach dress, how it flowed. Maddie kind of went with that, with how she, I think that it gave her another image for her own dancing, in terms of the arcs and shapes that she was making with her body. And she loved to run in it. And in the piece, she runs out that corner, comes around back. So it's always enjoyable when your costumes are enjoyed by the people that are wearing them. Another big concern I had was for the floor work in Christina's piece, because I thought in the excerpt that I showed, the dancers exit and they're sliding across the floor. I thought, oh, those dresses are going to end up turtlenecks around the necks. It's going to be a disaster. And it was, I don't know how it happened. It was construction, it was the fabric, it was the right atmospheric condition, I don't know. But I will analyze that costume, because when they were on the floor and then right before they exited, they lifted their leg, all of those skirts remained in place. They did not, collapse towards their waistlines. And then when they slid off, they didn't move up. So I think that's a combination of how the dancers were moving and then what the costume would do in the dance while they were moving in it. Because I certainly couldn't have predicted that just by having the dress on the form or an idea on a sketch of paper. So that's where seeing the costume on the dancer, does it meet the test? And as a designer, one has to set your design ego aside and accomplish the first mission, and that is to serve choreography and the vision of the choreographer. And that's fine. Everybody's happy. That's the goal. And it has to be engaging to the audience. So, yeah. Designing the costume has to, that link to the dancing person. That's critical. Anything else?
We have one up here.
I can't see because I'm blinded by the light.
Hello.
I've never been shy from a bright light in my face, but yes.
Yeah, so did any changes in the choreography as the work was being made? Did that alter your direction with the costume itself? And if so, how drastically did you have to make those changes?
Okay, the question is, did any changes in choreography require me to change the costume design? That's the eternal challenge to a costume designer.
Yes.
So you've got to roll with that. Let me think. No, I don't think so. I think that the costumes were, there wasn't anything that I had designed and said that's not going to work with that costume. Maybe because our collaboration, communication was so good throughout every step of the thing, maybe those challenges were avoided by the conversations that we had. It's like, I don't know, well, do you think this will work or that will work? And I always would say, the costume can adjust to the choreography. We're not going to adjust the choreography to the thing. And I told the dancers that night, so that to both the choreographers. No, you're not going to change your choreographic vision to match the dress or the pair of pants or whatever. I can change that. The point is that it's dance. But all of these elements have to be equally strong. So to answer your question, we didn't have any problems in this instance. That's not to say that that has not happened in the years that I've been doing this. It does happen. We've got to adapt. But getting back to my point of collaboration and communication, that really makes the process much more enjoyable and much more successful, I think, for everybody. Yes,
Hi.
I can't
I'm
see,
curious,
sorry.
you spoke about collaboration with the choreographers, and I'm wondering if you had any previous collaboration with the lighting designers in terms of discussion of color, texture.
Good question, because I have had, Brendan asked if I had had any collaboration with a lighting designer. In the past, I have had, a lighting designer can make all of your costumes look like you picked them out of the trash. Lighting across the parking lot. Throw them into the little air light that no longer exists. And then blow dry them. Bad. I was at the lighting work, part of the lighting rehearsal for Noelle's piece, and I just explained to the, I guess before the lighting designer had seen the costumes, what they were, what the general colors were. I did talk with the lighting designer for Christina's piece. Carrie, you did Christina's piece, didn't you? Yeah. Yes. Believe it or not, neutral and beige is not the easiest thing. It's not just a neutral slate, because with, depending on the intensity of the light, the shading of the light, they can just wash completely out, or they can all become blue, or a desert, maybe at night. So all of those things. So we did talk a little bit about what are those costumes going to, how's the light going to affect them. So that was good for me to learn that neutral does not necessarily mean that it's easy to light. Everybody hates green and love green, but the green dress I thought looked beautiful. So, but there are different fabrics or different colors that come into play. So certainly talking with the lighting designers early on as possible is good. Sometimes that person's not engaged when you're starting the costumes. So. Any other questions? Good question. Okay. The timeline, the question is, what is the timeline from the initial ideas of the discussion to the production? I met with Christina, the linen dresses, I think last May, June, thus the beach reason. And however, Noelle's piece premiered in October, maybe beginning of month. So I worked on hers from the end of August until then. That was a mad dash. I had designed and then sort of tabled Christina's project, and I worked on that from Christmas vacation until it premiered in February. And The Tempest happened in the last 4 weeks, or 1,000 weeks, it seems like. Yeah. Since Christina, so it was beginning of February, so for a month. It's all there were other things on the agenda, but yeah, that's and then to produce this, that's I'm not used to doing that. I had a dance career. I'm used to doing that. I was never as nervous as I was, 12 hours ago. And so all of these details, that's another set on top of the making of the things. So in retrospect, the easiest part for me was making the costumes. So do what you know. Expand what you know. Anyone else have a question? Now we have a reception waiting for us in the grad office, dance department office lobby.
Reception.